welcome again to another edition of Christian Answers for Today. I'm Pastor Jeff Short, and today's topic will be a topic that I have talked about over the last few years, not on this television program, but in other events and at other gatherings, and it is the Boy Scouts of America. I was once a Boy Scout many, many years ago, and I enjoyed my time in Boy Scouting. I did not achieve the Eagle Scout, but I got up to a Star Scout, and I went to many, many campouts, and I was a part of the Order of the Arrow fraternity, and I was also part of many other different events, the Mile Swim Club, and all kinds of other things. So I had a great time in the Boy Scouts. It saddens me to learn that the Boy Scouts are lowering their standards very, very low these days. Starting last year, when the Boy Scouts of America as an organization decided to allow openly homosexual boys into the scouting, which was a disappointment because the scouting had always maintained high ethical and moral standards. And so when you allow openly gay Boy Scouts into Boy Scouting, you are lowering the moral standards. That's obvious. So I was not happy with that, and I was understanding why many of the Boy Scouts had left the Boy Scouts last year, and some of the different sponsoring churches pulled out of the Boy Scouts in order to form their own scouting units. Well, this year there is another decline in the Boy Scouts, and that comes with the president of the Boy Scouts this year, Robert Gates. Now, Robert Gates was a high-level administration official in a couple of administrations, and he's supposed to be one of our top leaders in our country. But when you look at what he is doing to the Boy Scouts of America, you will find out that he is not a good leader. He does not have good leadership qualities, and you can see that already in his speech that he recently gave to the Boy Scouts of America at their national annual meeting just a couple weeks ago. And he gave a speech where at the very end of his speech, he began to outline his vision for allowing openly gay scout leaders to participate in the Boy Scouts. We're not talking about openly gay Boy Scouts. That's bad enough. But now Robert Gates is now saying that the Boy Scouts have to open their ranks to the openly homosexual scout leader and also other volunteer leaders. So he has gone from bad to worse, and he's only been in office 1 year. Now, I was reviewing the last 4 or 5 minutes of his speech, and we're going to do that today. And we're going to pick up at about the 9-minute mark, and we're going to comment on this. So let's roll that tape, and let's see what Robert Gates has to say, and then make some commentary to it.
I told you a year ago that I would oppose reopening this issue during my 2-year term as president of the BSA. I had hoped then for a respite, during which we could focus on healing our divisions from the 2013 decision, improving our program, strengthening our finances, and ending our decline in membership. However, events during the past year have confronted us with urgent challenge I did not foresee last year and which we cannot ignore.
And as you can see, Robert Gates appears to be overly concerned about the administrative statistics of Boy Scouts of America. He seems to be overly concerned about the number of boys in Boy Scouts. He seems to be overly concerned about the number of troops in Boy Scouts. He seems to be overly concerned about the financial numbers. In other words, he seems to be a manager rather than a leader. He seems to be a bean counter rather than a role model. And so he's trying to be this administrator, and he's trying to turn around a corporation like he would in the profit-making world, and he doesn't seem to be caring much about the core values of the Boy Scouts. And so from my impression of what he's saying, he seems to be almost a slave to numbers, and he seems to be a bureaucrat rather than a leader. And so that's very disappointing to see a leader of Boy Scouts who is more of a managerial type than a leadership type. And he talks about him wanting to not deal with this whole issue during the first year of his leadership, and his second year of leadership. But here again, he's dealing with the issue, so he's basically reneged on his promise to not go over this ground again. And he says it's necessary for the different realities that have presented themselves this year, but I think that's just an excuse. I think he's worried about the numbers, and he's worried about the administrative statistics of the Boy Scouts instead of worrying about keeping them faithful to their core vision. So let's play some more of this clip and see what he has to say.
We cannot ignore growing internal challenges to our current membership policy from some councils, like the Greater New York Council, the Denver Area Council, and others, in open defiance of the policy, to more and more councils taking a position in their mission statements and public documents contrary to national policy. Nor can we ignore the social, political, and juridical changes taking place in our country, changes taking place at a pace over this past year that no one anticipated. I remind you of the recent debates we have seen in Indiana, in Arkansas, and elsewhere over discrimination based on sexual orientation, not to mention the impending U.S. Supreme Court decision on gay marriage.
Well, as he goes through his list of concerns, he starts out with saying that some of the councils, Boy Scout councils, are openly rebelling against the policy of our national corporation, our National Boy Scout Leadership Center here. They're ignoring them, and they're going ahead and appointing openly homosexual scoutmasters. We can't ignore that. And then he goes on to the next. We can't ignore that the courts are beginning to more and more rule against groups that would hold to certain moral standards, such as no homosexual activity in their ranks. We can't ignore all of these. And he's like a woe is me attitude he's taking. He's taking this crying, whining kind of an attitude instead of a leadership. He's saying we have to face these realities. Well, yes, we have to face the realities, but deal with them. Deal with them as a man instead of this sniveling, whining leader that's supposed to be a leader, but is really more of a bean counter. And he seems to be lamenting the fact that there are challenges that he has to actually have to face. And that's what a leader does, is he has to face some challenges. And you don't just list a whole list of problems and then say, these are insurmountable. We have to cave into them. We have to give into them. We have to fall in line with what we're being pressured and intimidated to do. Instead of that tack, he should be saying, well, these are challenges that we have to face up to, and we have to stand up to and not be bullied by them. But that's not what he's saying. Let's hear some more.
I'm not asking the National Board for any action to change our current policy at this meeting. But I must speak as plainly and as bluntly to you as I spoke to presidents when I was Director of CIA and Secretary of Defense. We must deal with the world as it is, not as we might wish it would be. The status quo in our movement's membership standards cannot be sustained.
I would like to jump in here at this point when he says the status quo of the Boy Scouts policy cannot be sustained. What he's really saying is we're going to have a hard time standing up for our principles in the light of the government court rulings. We're going to have a hard time standing up to our principles of morality in the face of open rebellion by some of the Boy Scout councils, such as the State of New York Council and so forth. We're going to have a hard time in standing for our principles in a pagan world that is going down and down morally. And so what he should be saying is we have to stand strong, even though it's going to be hard. We have to stand firm, even though it's difficult, and we have to show some character and be leaders instead of followers. But that is not what he is saying. What he is actually saying is he's building a case for the Boy Scouts to cave in to the prevailing winds and to cave in and dumb down to the immoral standards of our society that are going lower and lower every day. He's advocating that we dumb down to them instead of rising up. Instead of telling boys and Boy Scouts and Scout leaders we must rise above our corrupt culture, he's saying We have to dumb down and lower ourselves to the standards of our corrupt culture. And this, my friends, is not leadership. It's not leadership in the Boy Scouts. It's not leadership in any organization. So we wouldn't want him to be our leader of our church. We wouldn't want to be around him in leadership of government. We wouldn't want him into any elected office. And I'm surprised that he actually is supposedly a leader in this country, because he doesn't show any kind of leadership backbone at all in this Boy Scout speech. Let's listen to some more.
We can expect more councils to openly challenge the current policy. While technically we have the authority to revoke their charters, such an action would deny the lifelong benefits of scouting to hundreds of thousands of boys and young men today, and vastly more in the future. I will not take that path.
So what he's basically saying is, he's saying the way things are happening right now, more and more councils will rebel against our moral policies of the Boy Scouts in America. And he's saying we could discipline them and take some kind of disciplinary action against them, but I won't do that because that would hurt boys, and I don't want to hurt boys. So basically he's saying, go ahead, councils, rebel against us. We're not going to do anything. We're not going to say anything. We're not going to take any action against that. So just go ahead, and more councils are going to rebel against our national policy, and more are going to be in defiance of our national policy on homosexuality, against that. But we're not going to do anything about it on a national level because I simply will not do anything. That's what he's telling the Boy Scouts. And now that's open season for rebellion when you have a leader that says he will not uphold the standards of the Boy Scouts. So, and he tells them there's going to be a lot more rebellion go on in the Boy Scouts. That's just an open invitation for more rebellion, and I think he sees that. I hope he sees that, and I can't understand why a leader would say such a thing. Even if he thought it, why would he even say it?
Moreover, dozens of states, from New York to Utah, are passing laws that protect employment rights on the basis of sexual orientation. Thus, between internal challenges and potential legal conflicts, the BSA finds itself in an unsustainable position, a position that makes us vulnerable to the possibility the courts will simply order us at some point to change our membership policy.
Now, what he's talking about is the fact that because of the courts in the United States are now very sympathetic to the homosexual cause and the homosexual lobby, and that more and more states are adopting pro-homosexual legislation and passing anti-discriminatory laws against clubs, organizations, and institutions that would prohibit homosexuality, including Christian churches and Christian institutions. He's afraid that the Boy Scouts of America will be sued by the courts. He's afraid that the Boy Scouts of America will be taken to court, they will lose, and then they will be forced to, under court order, hire homosexual Cub Scouts, scout leaders, and volunteers. And so he's saying we have to change our policy or else they will gang up on us and make us change our policy. Again, can you believe that this is supposed to be a leader of boys, leader of men, leader of the leaders of the Boy Scouts? He's supposed to be a leader, and he's acting like a sniveling, wimpy milquetoast of a leader who doesn't know how to face up to challenges. The Boy Scouts indeed do have challenges that they are facing. Their core values of morality and godliness and holiness that are partly derived from Christianity and the church, because most of the Boy Scouts meet in sponsored churches, facilities. These values were shaped by a Christian consensus that over the last 200 years or so in our country has shaped our moral standards. Now, with the collapse of Christian morality in our day and age, especially in the last 5 years, then all of these prohibitions against this sin and that sin, against homosexuality, against this or that, are collapsing. He's advocating that the Boy Scouts collapse on their moral standards and that we have to do it quickly as Boy Scouts, or else then the courts will come along and make us change whether we want to or not. Now, this is totally bogus. Now, he is totally acting on fear and anxiety and irrationality. First of all, the Boy Scouts went to the Supreme Court a number of years ago in another case, and they were found to have the right to set the standards for their own organization. So what he's talking about is totally fabricated. The Boy Scouts of America will not be forced to accommodate homosexuality just because all of the other institutions connected with society that are governmental are forced to do so. The Boy Scouts are a private organization. They are not government funded. They don't have to march to the same tune as the U.S. state and local governments. So they don't have to be forced to do anything they don't want to do. But he is confusing a private organization like the Boy Scouts with a government entity. And so he's saying, out of his own government experience, we're going to be forced to do this. He is totally wrong, and if he had good lawyers and good representation, legal representation, he would see that he is wrong. Now, the thing that he's worried about, though, is even though the Boy Scouts can't be forced to accept homosexual scoutmasters, they can have social pressure brought to them, and evidently he is not up to the challenge of standing up to the social pressures. He would rather take the boys in a direction that conforms with the social patterns of the day. So whatever the social mores, the changing, the shifting tides, and the turning, the wind blowing this way and that way, he would rather go with those shifting, changing standards rather than stand on what the Boy Scouts have always stood for. And that, my friends, is weak and uninspiring leadership coming from this man who is supposed to be the leader of the Boy Scouts.
We must all understand that this probably will happen sooner rather than later. In 2010, a single federal district judge in California overturned the military's Don't Ask, Don't Tell law, and the reversal was applied nationwide immediately. Only a stay granted by the appeals court, granted I believe mainly because we were in the process of changing the law, prevented dramatic disruption of the armed forces. We cannot predict if or when this might happen to us, but I personally believe our legal defenses have weakened since the Dale case. And if we wait for the courts to act, we could end up with a broad ruling that could forbid any kind of membership standard, including our foundational belief in our duty to God and our focus on serving the specific needs of boys. Waiting for the courts is a gamble with huge stakes.
Well, he's talking about the fact that he's so fearful that the courts will intervene in the organization of the Boy Scouts at some point in the near future, that he says if we don't willfully comply, if we don't willfully go along with the prevailing winds that are blowing in our society, and if we don't willfully open up our Boy Scout ranks of leadership to the open homosexual and the open gays and the people who are wanting to come in and use our Boy Scouts for their own agenda, if we don't openly embrace them and welcome them in, then the courts will force this upon us, and in the process, they will take control of us. They will take over the Boy Scouts and almost run it contrary to what our core values are. Well, my response to that is, if you open the Boy Scouts up to the leadership of openly homosexuals, you have already surrendered your core values. You have already surrendered your moral standards and moral high ground. You have already caved in. So I don't know what the courts could do much worse than that. He is simply saying, folks, if we don't act to capitulate now, then the courts will make us capitulate. In other words, he is saying we need to go ahead and do what we think they might force us to do. They might force us to do. He is so fearful. This man is operating under so much fear and so much anxiety and so much wimpy, snivelly, Casper Milquetoast administrative, bureaucratic fear that he cannot even stand up as a leader should stand up and say, boys, we don't know what the future holds, and we're not going to be afraid of the future. We are going to stand for the values that have kept us alive and well and training boys in character development for the last 100 or so years. We're going to stand strong on those principles, and we're going to lead society, not just follow society. We're going to lead in character, not cave in character. See, that's what he should be saying, but he's not saying that at all. What he's really saying is, guys, we need to put up the white flag. We need to surrender. We need to surrender our core values. We need to do it now, or else they're gonna come in and take our core values away. So it's better that we hand over our core values now of our own free will than have them take our core values. That's what he's essentially saying. And that, my friends, is poor leadership. I feel so bad for these scouts in the Boy Scouts today that have to operate under this really bad leadership. Let's roll some more.
Alternatively, we can move at some future date, but sooner rather than later, to seize control of our own future, to set our own course, and chart.
So what he's really saying when he says he wants to make sure that the Boy Scouts chart their own course and control their own destiny, what he's really saying is we're going to have to capitulate to the prevailing immorality of our culture. And so rather than have that culture force us through legal decision and court decisions to do that, we need to surrender and throw up our hands and throw up the white flag. And that, by doing that, we're controlling our own destiny and we're making our own decisions. Well, you can see through that so easily. It isn't controlling your own destiny when you preemptively surrender before you've even been beaten. If a football team takes the field and forfeits the game before the first play of the game is even played, that is not taking their football team in their own hands and controlling their own destiny. That is surrendering to the other team before any of the action even starts. And that's what Robert Gates is trying to do to the Boy Scouts. He's trying to basically say, if we want to be an organization and we want to remain a viable organization, we're going to have to surrender our values and our core values, such as our policy about sexual morality, no homosexual activity among leaders. They've already surrendered their morality as far as openly having gay boys in the Boy Scouts. Okay, that was already a capitulation. And now, a year later, just 1 year into his leadership, he's advocating that the one thing that they said they wouldn't do and they wouldn't revisit, he's going to revisit, and he's advocating that they open the ranks up to openly gay scout leaders. So now you're going to have role models for these boys who are openly gay, and he thinks that's a good thing, and if we do it quickly, then we won't have to surrender any of our core values. But what he doesn't see is that is a surrender of the core value. If you're at that point in your organization where you cannot even determine what is right and what is wrong for your own organization, you have already lost. You've already lost. Whether the court comes in and impose it, or you impose it on yourself because you're afraid the court will make you impose it, it doesn't matter. You've already lost. And that's what Robert Gates is saying. He's saying to the guys, hey, boys, we're going to lose. We're going to be a losing organization. So we might as well just embrace our loser status and control our own destiny. That isn't controlling your own destiny when you already concede losing before you've even taken the field. And that's what I think bothers me so much about Robert Gates. He seems to be a losing mentality even before he faces the challenge. That is not leadership. Leadership stands up to challenges, says we can do it. Our backs are against the wall. There are a lot of forces against us trying to attack our core values. We're going to stand strong and trust in God, and we're going to work hard to maintain our own internal integrity no matter what's happening in society. And we cannot control the wider society, but we can control our own internal organization, and we will do that and raise the character level of boys. And so that's what he needs to say. He's not saying it. He's actually advocating surrender.
And change our policy in order to allow charter partners, unit sponsoring organizations, to determine the standards for their Scout leaders. Such an approach would allow all churches, which sponsor some 70% of our Scout units, to establish leadership standards consistent with their faith. We must, at all costs, preserve the religious freedom of our church partners to do this. Our oath calls upon us to do our duty to God and to our country. The country is changing, and we are increasingly at odds with the legal landscape at both the state and federal levels.
Now, my question is, when he mentions God and country, he seems to say that our country is changing. Well, is God changing? Is God's standard for morality changing? He mentions God and country, but then he doesn't come back to God. Are we to suppose that because the country is changing as far as the opinion polls, that God's will concerning character and morality, that too is changing? He seems to be implying that. But why would he worry so much about what the country is doing as far as the opinion polls? Why should he be worried about the changing moral landscape in the population? Why isn't he more concerned about what God has said about morality and character? You know, if you're going to mention God, then talk about God. And you're going to mention God, you're going to actually talk about the standards and moral standard and character standards of God. Why then go directly to the opinion polls about a changing country and not talk about God? God is not changing. His standards are not changing as far as homosexuality. It is a sin. The Bible outlines it as a sin in the Old Testament and the New Testament. 2,000 years of Christian history has confirmed that it's still a sin. And just because the moral and social landscape in the United States is changing doesn't mean the standard of God has changed one bit. So if I were Robert Gates, I would not be so concerned about the changing landscape of the social and population in the United States. I would be more concerned about the eternal, moral, absolute standards that the Boy Scouts have embraced over the years and maintaining them. He seems to have his priorities in the wrong spots. Well, I hope that that's helped inform you today to help you make better decisions about people that you care about. And we'll see you back here next week on another edition of Christian Answers. God bless.